Hi everyone, welcome back to Pine Hollow Auto Diagnostics. Today we have a retro machine to work on. It's a 1993 Buick Century with a 3.3 liter V6. The symptoms are, it starts up, it idles fine, but as soon as you get on the throttle it just kind of falls on its face. Not drivable. Starts up great. Light throttle, no problem. If you do a quick snap, let's put it in gear. It does not want to go at all. Stalling out, backfiring, no power. Okay? So where do we start? So on these older GMs, as you've seen in some of Scanner Danner's videos, the fuel injectors are known to short out and the car would just either not start or not get enough fuel. So one of the quickest checks you can do, amp clamp around the two feed wires going to our injectors on our two banks. And I just quickly did that, and here's what the injector pattern looks like. You can see the pintle hub in there. It goes up to about 4 amps for 6 injectors. That's a good value. It doesn't look like it's the injectors in this case, and that's why I got the camera out. So next step, I think we can actually plug in our Veris and look at some live data. Mass airflow, fuel trims, stuff like that, and go from there. And this car stinks. It stinks pretty bad, like almost like a rich condition. So could be, but let's plug in our scanner and look at some data pins. Okay, here's our menu. We're going for codes first. Let's just see. Current codes, no codes present, history codes, throttle position sensor circuit high. Okay, we'll keep that in mind. Now let's go for data display. Nice. So we have a throttle percent right there. Flooring it right now, 100%, all the way back. There's our voltage. Good stuff. This is getting interesting. That's why I got the camera out. Let's see if we have, like you said, no codes. I'm going to focus in on this.
Anything pointing anywhere yet?
Not yet, but there's a lot of stuff to look at, for how old this car is.
Find it, Ivan.
Yep, we're working on it now.
Stupid.
Rich lean. Looks like that's working beautiful. Let's put it in gear and give it a little low to see if it's lean or rich. Sounds like crap, but
yeah, it's trying.
It's trying.
Can you read the pressure?
Lean. I don't like that. It should be still switching there. See how it's stuck lean? So it's exactly now. And now at idle, it seems to be pretty happy, So what I want to focus on is, let's look at RPM, fuel trim. Let's see, long-term throttle.
I'm leaning towards fuel because that probably is code.
Yep. We're leaning towards fuel, that's for sure. And mass airflow. Let's see here. Quad driver. I'm looking for short term here. Alright, let's look at that. For now, there's our MAF. I'm going to snap it. Put it in gear. Look what our fuel trims do. Look at that. Pegged out, pegged out, pegged out. Boom. Excellent. So we do have a lean condition under load. Now, is it our mass airflow or is it our fuel pump? Very interesting. And at idle, the fuel trims are pretty close to what 128 is the 128 should be like 0%. What else do I want to look at here? Exhaust oxygen. Where was that lean, rich lean PHAD? Is that it? There we go. And our MAF, okay. So see, as soon as you snap the throttle, we go lean. So again, under load. Fuel trims through the roof. Mass airflow. It's really struggling now. We're pegged out. Definitely a fuel delivery problem. Okay, so fuel pressure or mass airflow? What are the quickest ways to check those? It does smell rich, but it looks like it's lean. So, can we unplug this mass airflow, see what it does? We could try that. Let's try that. Alright, the mass airflow sensor is unplugged. Let's see if we have a substituted value. And we do. Alright, check that out. Now let's drop it in gear and see what it does. Look at that, 40 instead of 20. And we're rich lean, our fuel trims are pretty much perfect. I'm about to call this mass airflow sensor. Maybe take this car for a test drive, see how it runs with that thing unplugged. And just for reference, we did throw a mass airflow sensor failure. Cool. Alright, we're going to take it for a test drive. Alright, got the mass airflow sensor out. The wires do look kind of crappy, dirty, gunky. So we're just going to spray them off with some throttle body cleaner. And then take a little Q-tip, brush these guys off. It looks better already. See all that junk that came off there on the Q-tip? All that black goop. Oh, that one had a whole bunch of crap on it.
Good.
Yep. And
I can visually see it.
And look at it, it's made in Japan. What the heck? On a Buick on 93? I don't believe it. But it looks kind of old on the outside, so I don't know. Has this been replaced before with a Japanese part? Beats me. But we're going to clean these guys off and then redo our test.
Good shot.
And if, you know, maybe the customer is going to be lucky. On the rag, okay. Yep. Oh, those look very, very much
That's
better.
mine shined up and boom.
Yep. And it's, yeah, look at that. Nice and clean. So let's pop her in and look at our numbers again. Alright, so let's go back into our data stream, look at our mass airflow numbers and our rich lean condition.
You say you still hooked? Oh, good.
So rich lean, that's there. The only way to tell, put under load, and look at our fuel trims here. Now, I don't know, 50-50. Those fuel trims, they're still pegging out. 150, 172. Nope, no power.
Needs a mass airflow.
Needs a mass airflow. Those numbers are only half of what they should be. It's not reading right.
Okay, we tried.
Yep. We tried.
That's what I'm saying. try to save you money.
Absolutely.
Put her down.
So, in this case, mass airflow sensor cleaning did not do too much, and we're going to have to get either a junkyard unit or a replacement and go from there. But that's it for the diagnosis. Thanks a lot for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye. You wouldn't believe it. 5 days later, the Buick is back with the same symptoms. It has a remanufactured mass airflow sensor installed. Alright. And let's look at some codes and data. So the codes here, these older systems, they don't really store current codes, you know, unless it's happening right then and there. But in the history, we have these three. Now, last time to install this thing, the shop owner said that he had to unplug the throttle position sensor, and last time we set this mass airflow sensor failure. So to reset the codes, according to the scanner, we need to disconnect the battery for about 30 seconds to clear diagnostic trouble codes. We could do that, but let's look at the data again. Because the symptoms are almost identical. He says it has a little more power, but not quite enough. So, if you remember last time with the mass airflow sensor plugged in, we had about 20 grams per second at 20% throttle opening in gear. With the mass airflow sensor unplugged, we had almost double that, like 40 grams per second at 20% throttle. And the car ran well then. So let's do the same experiment. I'm going to go 20% throttle, and we're showing about 28 grams per second. That is just bizarre. And the car doesn't stall completely, but it definitely lacks power. So what can we say here? The mass airflow, the reman unit, worked well for 5 days. I didn't get, do the same experiment with it, but now it's better than the original airflow sensor, but it's underreporting the mass airflow. Just to be 100%, I want to do a couple electrical checks right at the sensor, but I'm going to call this sensor again. That's ridiculous. So let's go under the hood. So here's our mass airflow sensor signal. And if we rev the engine up, that frequency should increase. Yep. So the sensor is working, but it's not reporting the correct number for our airflow. And that's the ground is good, and finally the power, 12 volt feed. Yep, we're at battery voltage there. Looks good. 14.5. So reman sensor lasted 5 days, and we're back in the same boat. Now we're going to the junkyard and try to find a used unit and try that out. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed that little case study on the Buick Century with the faulty mass airflow sensor. I wanted to do a quick recap here and discuss how and when we can use substituted values in scan data to quickly and accurately diagnose a vehicle. Now, as you saw in this case, it didn't take very long to make a definitive call on this mass airflow sensor, and we didn't even need to do any electrical checks to make a definitive call. When is this possible? And also, I wanted to cover this. They call it the unplug it test in the field. You unplug a sensor and the vehicle runs better. Does it necessarily condemn that sensor? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. There are some people who are, fans of this, and I know, like my friend Keith over at New Level Auto, he is not a fan of this unplug it test, and I can see why. Because on newer vehicles, the backup strategies are so complicated that, as in like European cars, you can't even predict what they're going to do when you unplug something. So sometimes it works. In this case, on this 1993 Buick, I think it was the perfect test to come to a conclusion, and I just wanted to touch on a few things when this test can be used and when it's effective. So the first kind of step to this approach is you have to look at the scan data. Obviously, you need to have a vehicle that's new enough to provide you with scan data, and you need to have a tool that can read it. In this case, we used the Snap-on Verus, which is actually very good in talking to these older cars. This was pre-OBD2. It used the GM 12-pin connector, and GM, even back in the early 90s, had a very good data stream, which was very helpful to us here. So we need scan data. Then you also need to have at least a basic understanding of how the system works. What is the computer looking at, which sensors, to determine the output. In this case, we had a problem with fuel delivery, right? Fuel delivery. And under load, we saw that the oxygen sensor was reporting a lean condition, and the fuel trims were ramping up to compensate for that. So I guess how this system works, the inputs that we need to determine the outputs, and the output is here, assuming that your fuel pump has a constant pressure, which is a known good, which we didn't check, but we didn't need to in this case. The injector pulse width. That is the output that is calculated by the computer and commands the injectors to open a certain width to inject a certain amount of fuel into the engine. So the inputs on a normal system, so first let's write down how the system works normally. Obviously, a key player here is the mass airflow sensor. If the computer knows how much air is coming into the engine, it has a baseline fuel table. It'll have a base pulse width, and then in closed loop, the computer uses the oxygen sensor to trim the pulse width to get a good stoichiometric ratio, right? So in a normal state, the mass airflow and the oxygen sensor determine our injector pulse width. Now you might ask, what about the TPS? What about the engine coolant temp sensor or the intake air temp sensor? Yes, the computer does read them, but as you saw in this case, all the other sensors were working fine, and the skewed mass airflow drastically reduced engine power. It could not compensate by having a skewed mass airflow reading. Okay? Now, the backup strategy in this case, I'm saying that to point out that not all cars will do this. If you unplug the mass airflow sensor, you might not even see a substituted value on your scanner. It might just go to 0 grams per second. And that's because the backup strategies will be different. But in this case, the backup strategy. Now, I didn't read up on this as in, theory and operation. This is just based on experimental evidence. This thing uses the TPS and the RPM and the O2 sensor as the main inputs to calculate the pulse width. So even though when we unplug the MAF, the input isn't there, but it still went into closed loop and it still used the oxygen sensor. So this backup strategy actually worked pretty well. The car regained its power, it had no hesitations, it drove great. Check engine light was on, obviously, but in this case it was drivable just when we took away this sensor reading from the computer. Now, on this vehicle, another common strategy, or I should say on other vehicles, is to use the mass or the manifold absolute pressure, the MAP sensor, as a backup, because some cars don't even have a mass airflow sensor, but this one does not have a MAP sensor. It only has a MAF, an airflow sensor. So anyways, figure out approximately how your system works, and then if you unplug a sensor and you do have a substituted value on your scanner, then you can start making an educated deduction of, are we on the right track? So as you saw in the video, with the original MAF, at a TPS reading, what was it, 20%, our MAF read about 20 grams per second, and this was in drive. So we're power braking the engine, we're applying some throttle, and we had 20 grams per second on our MAF, and the car was really stumbling, and the oxygen sensor was showing lean. We definitely had a lack of fuel. Now, with the first reman sensor, I left the shop, they put it in, they drove around fine, according to the customer, drove fine for 5 days, okay? And then it came back with a similar problem, but it wasn't as bad. It made it to the shop under its own power, but it was just, the power wasn't there. So, as you saw in the video again, with the reman sensor number 1, at 20% TPS, now we had approximately 30 grams per second airflow. And that's still, it was still lean, but it didn't stumble quite as bad. Now, the substituted value, so this is with mass airflow unplugged. At 20% TPS, we had 40 grams per second, and there we had a good mixture, switching rich and lean, and the fuel trims were actually right where they needed to be, right around 0%. So in this case, just that quick test, looking at scan data and unplugging the mass airflow sensor, we saw what the computer wanted to see. At 40 grams per second, it was happy, right? So if we had a known good mass airflow sensor, we should expect to see around 40 grams per second airflow under these conditions. So you can see that we're not just saying, oh, it's lean under load. We actually had a very specific, we picked a number, 20% throttle position, we put it in drive, and then we can actually see how well these mass airflow sensors are performing under the same conditions. That's key if you want to actually, compare a known good to a known bad. And apparently these reman units are just complete garbage because they don't last 5 days and they keep coming back with the same issue. And you know, when it came back, I'm like, uh-oh, did I make the wrong call? No, it was just bad parts, and you can't get a new sensor for these things anymore since, you know, the car is, what, 24 years old. So, and they even tried a junkyard unit. That did not work at all. So I think right now the customer's just driving around with the mass airflow sensor unplugged. The car runs beautifully, and the check engine light's on, but who really cares? So that's kind of a little recap. Hope you find that useful. Again, in this case, the unplug it test I think was absolutely the most definitive and quickest test to get to the root of the problem. On other makes and models, on newer vehicles, you have to be careful with this test. You can definitely try it. It can't hurt. You can unplug a sensor and nothing's going to blow up, but the readings that you get might lead you in the wrong direction. Last thing I wanted to cover is, how do you tell if the sensor is bad, or if you actually have a condition where the sensor is reporting a skewed value? You might ask, oh, how do you know this thing didn't have vacuum leaks and the mass airflow sensor was not reporting enough since there was unmetered air going into the engine? Well, a couple of reasons. So as you saw in the video, this mass airflow is basically bolted right onto the throttle body, right? So one variable is you could have a torn air tube between the airflow sensor and the throttle body, and you would have a problem under load where air is getting sucked into that crack in the intake tube, but that's not even a variable here. If you had a vacuum leak, where would the problem occur, or under what conditions? If you saw here at idle, under no load, when there's high engine vacuum, we actually had decent fuel trim numbers, and the mass airflow was supposedly reporting pretty close to what like what 4 grams per second, I think. So the system was happy. As soon as you put it under load and the airflow increases, the sensor underreported by the old one was like 50% too low. The first reman one was like 25% too low. So again, that's just another kind of verification that we're indeed making the right call, even though all these reman sensors are not proper for this vehicle. So definitely watch out for that. Make sure you're not you don't have a condition where the sensor is actually reporting what it sees, but there's another problem. So just a couple variables there. It's always fun to play around like this. It'll keep you sharp, and I hope you enjoyed that little case study and discussion. And let me know if you have any questions in the comments. I always like reading those. I appreciate the feedback, and as always, I'll see you next time. Bye bye.